I'm just going to start with a little bit of a modified pepeha. So I acknowledge that we are on the ancestral land of the Tangata Whenua, the Maori people, and that I have come from the traditional territories of the First Nations and Métis, whose footsteps have marked these lands for centuries. Ko muske gosik te whenua tupu. I grew up in Stony Plain, which is on Treaty 6 territory. No amiskuchi waskihika ni Kanata aho. I am from Edmonton in Canada. Ko ki Saskatchewani to awa. So the North Saskatchewan River is the water that brings life to that area. Kai tamaki makaro e noho ana. I now live in Auckland, and ko Amber Garret tako ingoa. My name is Amber Garret. I make this acknowledgement as an act of gratitude to those whose territories I've resided on as a step in the journey of reconciliation. So this is kind of just a little hybrid of the pepeha and the Canadian Indigenous acknowledgement that you usually do at the beginning of presentations. All right, so I'm going to present on digital assessments. My dissertation at the university is actually about the Numeracy CAA. So what I did is I went into a school and I interviewed 9 different students about their experiences in writing the Numeracy CAA, from their presentation or the preparation that they did to the writing itself, and then their reflections when they got their grades. These students came from a number of different backgrounds. Some of them were comfortable with technology, some of them were not comfortable at all with technology. Some of them had special assessment conditions. Some of them have migrant backgrounds. So there's quite a wide breadth of perspectives. I also interviewed teachers from 4 different schools, including higher decile and lower decile schools, not that we use deciles anymore, but to get, again, a really good perspective of what the teachers felt. And that was an interesting piece because nobody from my background research that I've done, nobody's actually done deep review and research on teacher perspectives of digitizing assessments in mathematics. There's a lot of like, what do the students think and how do they perform? But not a lot of people have asked the teachers, you know, how do you feel about this? How does it affect your teaching? How does it affect what you think mathematics means in society today? So what I'm going to do is I am going to kind of do a bit of like a mixed presentation. So there's going to be some information about the equity, accessibility, and reliability of digital assessments. And I'm also going to intersperse some information from the research that I've done and the response that I've gotten. And it'll be kind of a reflection interactive moment, because what I found is when I was interviewing those teachers from the 4 different schools, many of them said that the act of having the interview done was some of the best professional development that they had had on digital assessment up until that point, because there has been a lack of professional development for digital assessment. So there will be a lot of time to like reflectively think. I'll also encourage you guys to provide your feedback and opinions. You're welcome to hop in and give commentary if you want when we have those interactive slides. But to start off with, just a little bit of review of like, why do we even care about digital assessments? So from 2019 to 2021, the number of digital assessments has increased dramatically. So it's nearly doubled as far as NCA. So we're talking specifically high stakes assessment. And that's really important because mathematics has a ton of formative work in the digital sphere. But high stakes assessment is kind of a separate entity. And the students, it's increased student impact by 172%. So that means that multiple students are writing digital assessments in many classes across their NCA spectrum. This is now touching mathematics because within the field of mathematics, we now have the Numeracy CAA, which is called digital first, which means that students are expected to write it as a digital assessment. The exception would be to have it on paper. So most students would be writing it in the digital environment. So the transference, what's been found within research, when we transfer a test from paper onto a digital platform, the result is not neutral, even if the test itself stays exactly the same in every way. So the questions are the same, the structure of the question is the same, the options are the same, the timing is the same, the students will perform worse in the digital environment. And it's very much so driven by that environmental change of how do they navigate and how do they feel about it being on a computer. However, even though they perform slightly worse, their emotional reaction is that they like it a lot better. So students love the things that apparently don't work well for them. The reason that they perform slightly worse is there's an increase in cognitive load, and this is related to students' ability to navigate on a computer screen as effectively as they can on paper. In mathematics, they're using paper all the time, every day in class. They write on paper, they know how to write out their mathematical working on paper. And then they come to the test, and at that time, most of the students haven't actually had a lot of experience in the digital sphere. So once they're trying to do mathematics on the computer, they are not only just thinking about the mathematics, they're also thinking about how the computer itself works. And the analogy I have for this, it's a bit of a weird analogy, but I think it works well, is imagine that you have a child who's been taking swimming lessons since they were like, 6 months old. So aware that we're in an island nation, they're taking swimming lessons every single week. They're really, really great at swimming. And then one day they say like, oh, I want to take dance lessons. And you go, okay, cool. We'll put you in dance class. At the end of the year, there's going to be a recital. So they take dance class for a year while they're doing swimming lessons. And at the end of the year, the recital comes around and it's synchronized swimming. And you say to them, well, you know how to swim and you know how to dance. How come you can't synchronize swim? So it's that kind of idea that we as teachers often think, oh, students know a lot about computers because they're digital natives. They grew up with us. They know what's going on. We don't need to teach them. And then we're going to teach them mathematics because that's the new concept. At the end of the year, we're going to test them on the mathematics. But we're testing them on the mathematics in the digital realm, but it's a realm that they haven't really interacted with well, so they don't actually know how to navigate the assessment platform. And that's where the tension exists. That's where the problems happen. So students are more likely to be assessed formatively in mathematics than in other subject areas, but they're less likely to be assessed summatively. So what that means is that they have a lot of practice in other platforms like Google Slides or My iMaths, those kinds of things. But when it comes to the assessment master platform, which is the one that the NCAA uses, students are very uncomfortable using the assessment master platform for mathematics. So that's kind of what we want to look at is how can we make that a little bit of an easier transition. All right. And the problematic part too is that how we assess becomes the enacted curriculum. And what that means is, how prior to this big NCAA curricular change, one of the commentaries that was coming down was that teachers are teaching to the test. But of course, teachers are teaching to the test because you want your students to perform really well, and the test is the measure of performance. And by teaching to the test, you actually change what you end up teaching. So you change the curricular expectations within your classroom. The same thing happens when we change the format of the assessment. So if we digitize the assessment, it changes the mathematics that we choose to teach and how we choose to teach it. If we're thinking in our mind, how could this be formatted for a multiple choice question? We're going to change the way we teach and start teaching less of the process thinking and more of the solution focused thinking. So the way that we test is actually very, very impactful on the way that we act inside the classroom. All right, so that was a big lot of intro stuff. So let's have a little bit of a think. So as I said, I will give you a chance to look at some of the interview questions and reflect for yourself. So this is one of the interview questions that we ask teachers. Describe your experience in preparing students for their first high stakes online mathematics assessment. So I'm going to give you guys just like a really uncomfortable 30 seconds to think and reflect of how you would prepare students for an online math assessment. And is it different than what you would do if you were preparing students for that same assessment on paper? So your 30 seconds starts now. Okay. So hopefully we had a little bit of time to reflect. If anybody wants to comment on what they might do or how they would change things, or if they think that they would keep things the same, you're very welcome to add your commentary either in the chat or unmute yourself and give a little, hey.
I was just thinking personally, like I have a year 11 class that focuses on numeracy, and I have them last period Friday, which is a great, great period. So we've been doing numeracy practice in that slot all year, but I slowly integrated the technology in. The NZAMP practice tasks that are run through Desmos are quite useful. But I found there that in the technology space, students were doing a lot more guessing. They would just put an answer in and click submit. And the Desmos task, quite like the real NCA assessment, is once you put the thing in, you can't change it. And then they would look at their friends, and their friend would get it marked right. They wanted to change their answer. So just learning the basics that in a digital space, once you'd put that answer in, I guess you could on the NZQA one, you can go back and change things. But the students were more likely to guess answers than when they were writing on paper and actually trying things out.
Yeah, that's what the research shows as well, as in a digital sphere, students are more likely to be exploratory, which means they want to toggle back and forth between different questions. So if it is one of those situations where your first entry, once it's locked in, that's all it is, that's really negative for them because they will inherently guess and then reinforce their answer on a digital test. Whereas on a paper test, because it's more concrete, they'll take more time to pre-think and follow through with their thinking process. And the answer that they put down is more likely to be the right answer the first time. So if they do get penalized for their initial guesswork, then that's going to be really, really detrimental for them in the
The
digital.
same thing happens on students with Education Perfect, right? They just like uh, trial and error, trial and error. Oh, it gives me the little tick, submit.
Yeah.
And then when you highlight their completion statistics, they've got 100% completion, but their accuracy rate's like 25%. And yeah, so it's quite interesting.
Mhm. Yeah, so let's take a look at what some of the teachers said. So we had some teachers who said, I don't think it makes any difference. I don't think it has affected my teaching at all. We had other teachers who said, if it's a tech enhanced examination, we need to offer the students some kind of supplementary information on how to use technology. So even though we did have teachers within the study who said, like, yes, they need to learn something about tech, none of the teachers who I interviewed actually taught any of the digital skill sets within their mathematics classrooms. All of the teachers that I talked to started focusing exclusively on content only. And then towards the end, some of them put some of that content online, but online in that it was a PDF of the paper copy. It wasn't an interactive online, or they might have used like Google Forms, but it wasn't the actual assessment platform that the students would be using in the end. So there's some room there for revision of what it means to expose students to online work. What the students said, some of the students, more than one student, didn't actually know that it was a digital test until the day of the test. So this tells us that teachers are not prioritizing the idea that it's digital, it's different, and we need to learn differently and execute mathematics a little bit differently. Some of the students felt that their teachers did a good job of balancing digital and physical. And then some students thought that like it's very important to learn about the digital platform because then that would give them, you know, a bit less nervousness on the day because they would know how it works, right? So our second reflection question, and if I go back there, so this is a really, really powerful exercise to do. Imagine that you're a student with your own background. So don't imagine that you're a student as in your classroom, the students that you see, but if you yourself with your own background, your own history, the countries that you came from, the education that you have, if you were a student, what might cause you to be apprehensive or confident about this digital test? So again, another uncomfortable 30 seconds to think about that. All right, so does anybody have anything that they'd like to contribute via chat or vocalizing? What would cause you any kind of apprehension or confidence if you knew that the test was going to be a digital test?
Yeah, feel free, team, to chuck the ideas in the chat. In the last presentation that we just had, there was quite a bit of that ongoing.
To kind of get you started, what some of the teachers said were they didn't feel very technologically advanced. Some of them felt like they were a jinx when it came to computers, and so that brought a lot of anxiety. A lot of teachers across the board feel a bit intimidated when it comes to using technology. We had some teachers talk about how the assessment platform is just overly confusing, so why bother teaching it because I don't understand how it works, which, yes, it is a bit confusing and a bit cumbersome, but it's still something that, you know, needs to be sat with in order to teach our students how to use it effectively so that they can perform effectively on the test. Some teachers thought that online was going to be more visually pleasing, more interactive. And so he felt that the students were going to be used to that content. So it would be a lot better than paper. And in that way too, some of the students felt the same way. They felt that there was a bit of a novelty factor to doing an online test. So it kept their attention more than it did on paper. One student described falling asleep on a paper-based test, but when it was an online test, the brightness of the screen was just like drawing them in, kind of like a computer game. And what the students said that, well, some of them were more nervous about being it online because they haven't done many math tests online. They're normally on paper. So they were nervous about technology. They were nervous about clicking from thing to thing. They were nervous about something happening or their work being deleted. And for some of the students that I interviewed, their work was deleted. They did lose everything. They had to start over. Some of them had Wi-Fi issues. So there was a lot of apprehension about the technological space. Some students felt like paper was more conducive to how they thought. So when I asked students to kind of close their eyes and envision doing mathematics in their head, what did it look like? Some of them thought in a paper-based space in their mind. Others felt that there was more of a flow of ideas when they were typing because they were so used to typing, but they were not used to writing with a pencil. So they had to stop and think of how to write down with a pencil or pen, and that interrupted their flow of thought. So for those students, they thought that online was better. Other students, again, thought that digital has become so normalized, that they felt that most people would probably prefer a digital space. And it turns out that it's a little more on the side of students wanting digital assessments. But there is still a fair portion of students who are really uncomfortable writing things digitally. And that's something that we really need to think carefully about, considering that we're moving towards a digital first landscape. So a few things to really consider seriously. The socioeconomic status of students is impacted by digitizing assessments. There is a 16% performance variance in New Zealand for digitized assessments. That's based off of the PISA results from 2022. So 16% of the change in student performance could be based on their socioeconomic status. And some of the things that feed into that is 1/3 of students in social housing in New Zealand don't have any internet access. 87% of schools do provide devices to students, but only 6% of those schools allow students to take those devices home. So a lot of times the students who are disadvantaged at home only get exposure to a computer when they're at school. And a lot of the math classes, a lot of the teachers that I spoke to tried to stop their students from using a computer during math class because they felt that math was a paper-based subject. So those students, therefore, don't get a lot of encounters with technology, a lot of time to practice. Furthermore, there were some teachers who were saying like, oh yeah, they'll learn how to use these kinds of things in their other classes, or we've given them the codes, they'll be able to access it and practice online at home. But for those students who can't take a device home and don't have a device at home, that option just isn't there. There's a performance preference, favoring paper for lower socioeconomic students. So students who are in the lower socioeconomic status bracket, they prefer to write on paper. Students in the higher socioeconomic bracket have no preference. They perform just as well on paper or digitally. So in theory, that would mean that paper would be the most equitable. But because of what's called the anachronism argument, which just means like we're moving in the direction of technology, so we need to keep integrating that where we can't always live in the past. We need to find a way to bring those lower socioeconomic students up into a sphere of being comfortable and performing well in a digital atmosphere. Another area of interest is students with disabilities. So this one is a bit mixed. There's, again, internet access issues. So 29% of students with disabilities in New Zealand do not have consistent access to the internet at their house. And for certain disabilities, specifically students with visual impairments, they find that there's not very much adaptability to them being able to use online devices compared to being able to use paper-based devices. The accommodations they have for digital devices are really prohibitively expensive. So in that sense, it's more affordable to use paper. However, on the other side of things, there's speech-to-text programs, which don't always translate mathematical symbols accurately, but at least they exist. And for other types of neurological disabilities, for example, with people with low visual learning abilities or ADHD, they tend to perform worse in migratory assessments like the Numeracy CAA. So migratory means you take it straight from paper, you put it online. But if it's a transformative assessment, so that means there's an interactive component. Maybe they're working with Desmo set inside of the test, they perform better. So if there's some element of interactivity, some kind of gamification, then those students perform really, really well in a digital atmosphere compared to a paper-based atmosphere where they tend to lose more focus. And overall, greater access to adaptability and accommodations is good for all students across the board. So if we think about students with disabilities when we're preparing them for digital assessments, we're inherently thinking of all students, because all students are able to use speech to text. All students are able to use the highlighters and the Zoom functions in order to improve their performance. So another bit of an uncomfortable thinking time. How do you think online formats impact different groups of students? So thinking of the different groups of students that you teach or the different groups of students you may encounter, how do you think being online would change their interaction with an assessment compared to what it might do for other students? So 30 seconds to just think about that. All right, any thoughts on how different groups of students might be impacted or how it might change from group to group?
I did put in the chat that I find students when they're using the devices to practice, there are students that are easily distracted by their devices. It's almost a learned behavior. When they come into class, they open the lid and they have millions of windows open. Whereas some students are digitally native is not the right word I'm looking for, but like they can get on a device and be focused. So those two groups of people is what I've seen in classrooms.
Mm-hmm. We had one of the teachers I interviewed work specifically with students with special education needs. And they had mentioned that they didn't like to have their students using digital devices in the classroom because they were never sure if their student was actually working on the task that was assigned or they were working on something else as soon as the teacher wasn't looking. And I think that's something that we probably all have encountered, that doubt of like, is that kid even doing what I asked them to do, or are they just having a game in a different tab, you know? Yeah. And what you'd mentioned about like, are they going to stay on task? There is a certain effect. Oh, now I've kind of lost my train of thought, but I will be talking about it a little bit in the future. This idea of seriousness and how it specifically relates to New Zealand students and what New Zealand students think of putting things online. Is it as serious as it is on paper? So little tidbit for the future. What did the teachers that I talked to think about different groups? Some teachers felt that we were limiting the opportunity for students who were coming not from the New Zealand background, even though they might be brilliant students. There were 3 different accounts of teachers talking about students who were international students coming to New Zealand with excellent mathematics skills, even skipping grades ahead, but were not able to pass the Numeracy CAA because in their home country, which was typically a second or third world country, they didn't have a lot of practice using computers to do online mathematics work. So in spite of the idea that we've all gone through COVID, so everybody has done online work, that's not necessarily true for all of the students, especially students who are coming here from other countries. Many teachers acknowledge that with disabilities, it might be better to have an online test, especially for students who usually use a reader-writer. There was a lot of savings there, not only in the allocation of rooms, but also the allocation of personnel to sit next to a student, because if it's online and they don't need a reader-writer because there's speech to text, then that kind of relieves a little bit of the workforce. And in poorer areas, some teachers felt that there would be far more use of paper. Some teachers said that the students that they taught didn't have access to the internet, especially ones who lived in island areas off the coast of New Zealand. So there's some barriers, because when those students come to the mainland to do final assessments, they were completely lost of what to do in the digital environment. The students also reflected on who would be, at an advantage or a disadvantage. And students felt that some people who grew up with technology type families some people who grew up with really technology type families might be used to technology, but others might not have parents that are so used to technology. So they, as students of or children of technologically disadvantaged parents, they also might be disadvantaged. And one of the students who did have a learning disability said that she didn't really like saying to the teachers, "Oh, I have this thing," because she didn't want to have to sit next to somebody and have somebody reading the test to her. So having the access to a digital atmosphere meant that she felt more like the rest of the students in the classroom and less kind of isolated. So she felt that she had more autonomy. She was able to do the test by herself, and it was really her work that was coming through without having the aid of a reader-writer. So some of the things to think about when we're considering what we need to teach students and what we need to fall back on. The idea of digital natives. So this is actually a true fallacy. Students are not digital natives. Yes, they grew up with technology. Yes, they have technology in their hands all the time, but they're typically not very good at using technology. And they're very cautious of, in high stakes situations, clicking on the wrong thing, because they know from using technology in low stakes situations that you click on the wrong thing and bad stuff happens. All right, so there's a little bit of a risk of overestimating what could be put into an online environment and keeping that communication completely neutral and completely the same. Because when we put something online, it changes what it means a little bit. So there needs to be explicit teaching of how to navigate a test and how to read and how to use any annotation tools. If that doesn't happen, then students don't really get the full capabilities that they would have. There's also this fallacy of the gamer's advantage. So the idea that, especially for boys, that, oh, boys are playing video games all the time, so they're probably like really, really good at digital assessments. So what they found for gamers, students who were using online games a lot, their speed was really, really high compared to other students. So they would be really fast at clicking on whatever needed to be clicked, but their accuracy had no advantage at all. So even though they were doing things very, very quickly, they were not any better than any other student at their actual performance online. So they still had the same tendency to click the wrong things or enter the wrong answers. There's also problems with the physical experience of writing online tests. So there's a human aversion to online reading. We tend not to be able to hold an idea of the whole size of an exam in our head and where we would be able to find things. So that mental navigation is lost. So there needs to be a navigation bar, which the NCAA has provided, which is great, but not all students actually recognize that that was a navigation bar. There is also a positive tactile response to paper-based tests. You can feel it and it feels more real. It feels like there's more gravity to a paper-based test. It's more serious. And there's greater access to adaptive technology as an asset to all students. There's also this thing that I find incredibly interesting called the split effect. So we think, okay, they're doing this digital online test, they're not showing their work, but we'll give them a piece of scrap paper so they'll still be able to do all of their mathematical working, and that'll make it all even. But what actually happens is students have an increased cognitive load from looking back and forth between their scrap paper and the screen, and they're more likely to make mistakes, and they're more likely to lose their place. And this was one of the most prevalent things that happened to students in my study. So there were a lot of students who were saying like, I couldn't keep track of where all of my work was. I tried to go back to a question that I skipped because it was too hard and I couldn't find the work that I had done before. Everything was just all squiggles. Some of my writing was upside down. I was completely lost. So we actually have to intentionally teach students how to use scrap paper in order for them to have the same experience in showing their mathematical working to get the correct answers. So another quick, uncomfortable thought test. How does the mode of assessment impact how fair the test is as a measure of mathematical abilities? So at this point, we're thinking of the validity of a test. When we change it to a digital format, are we still able to test the same mathematics that we want to show that the student has achieved? So take some time to think about how does digitizing change the validity of a test? All right, any thoughts on can we test the same things when a test is digital? Is it actually the same information that we're able to get out of students?
Yeah, I'd noticed the algebra thing, like students typing their working or using the on Education Perfect using the handwriting sort of tool. They didn't quite like showing their working in a digital format, and they were quite happy to write show their working on a paper-based test. But I guess it's probably more of a problem with algebra and numeracy, things like showing multiplication symbols or squares. If you're um, finding the area of a rectangle, I guess you can use the X button for times, but some students don't know that the star symbol on the 8 is a multiplication thing, and the backslash is used for division. So yeah, I felt that in the digital format, students didn't like entering their working or tried to make it more succinct and often left out gaps because they didn't know how to operate the keyboard for mathematical symbols.
Absolutely. Students like absolutely hated the fact that the division symbol is a slash. That came up a number of times. They are really, really uncomfortable with that because it looks visually different. The star and the multiplication symbol are close enough together that they could kind of like make that link, that jump, but the slash compared to the division symbol was a real cognitive block for them. And one student actually talked about how it threw off his entire thinking pattern because he was so just consumed by the idea of like, why does this look different? And this isn't how it's supposed to look when I write mathematics.
I think it's a wider issue though, to be honest, because like students who don't bring their calculators to class, like I've got a couple of basic ones in my drawer, and I hand one out, and one kid said to me, "Well, where's the fraction button?" And I pointed at the division symbol, and they
Yeah.
don't quite get the get the two things are the same.
Yeah, we also had some teachers talking about how they were encountering more and more students who didn't know how to use calculators, or their families told them that they weren't allowed to use a calculator because that would mean that they weren't good at mathematics. So they had never actually had any practice using a calculator before. So yeah, and again, that's all part of that, the need for the teacher to step into the space to be explicitly teaching about tech. So some of the teachers felt that the thinking processes, especially algebra, like was said, was going to be compromised by being in a digital space. One really important commentary was they're putting in the answer, but they're doing all of their thinking on paper. So when we have tests that are multiple choice, like the Numeracy CAA or fill in the blank, the test changes the values that we are communicating to students. We're communicating to students that the value within mathematics is the answer. Whereas previous to these digitized tests and formats, we typically taught students that the value is in their working and the thinking process and the flexibility that happens between the question and the answer. So we're actually communicating a different type of mathematics. Other teachers felt that if it was just paper-based, they would expect them to do really, really well, to see all the steps. And also that once they lose that paper-based working, the students can't get any partial marks for their working in the margins or their intermediate knowledge. The students felt that the test was kind of there, but it didn't have a broad enough option of questions. And that student in particular brought up ideas of geometry and algebra not being available on the test because those types of questions can't be translated to a digital environment. And a lot of students talked about the difficulty with writing shapes, symbols, letters, and that transferability of like typing in English written language is different than typing mathematical language. All right, one last little thing, and then we're going to take a look at the assessment master just to give some really, really important tips. So there has been work that has shown that New Zealand students do not take digital assessments as seriously as they take paper-based assessments. So that was based off of both PISA and TIMSS assessments. New Zealand students in particular, compared to others around the entire world, really don't think that digital tests matter that much. The students that I talked to also said that digital tests, they don't think that it has the same gravity as a paper-based test, unless their teacher repeats them over and over and over again, hey, this is important, because they do so much other stuff on computers that's for fun, that there's a bit of a translation lost in saying that digital work is also important. However, digital tests do tend to reduce anxiety, which is great, but they also tend to be focused on more complex questions because we tend to feel that the foundational level skills, if a computer can do it, why should we put it on a test? So we're losing some of the foundational skills in order to test more complex skill sets. So that's losing out our lower half of students. Scoring platforms are a bit compromised because there's no partial marks. There's also something called the mode effect, which is as soon as you put it on a computer, no matter what, it's considered to be more difficult. And that's just because of navigational issues. And human analysis, when humans are marking paper-based tests, when teachers mark paper-based tests, we tend to actually assume that students are thinking things that they're not really thinking. So by not showing their work, it's giving teachers more objective reality of student skills, which is a bit of an interesting thing. All right. Really quickly, what can we do? We can set the scene, meaning communicate the mode. Tell the student if the test is going to be on a computer or on paper. Tell them how much time they have. A lot of the students did not know that they had unlimited time. A lot of them felt that because they could see the clock in the bottom corner of the screen, they were constantly thinking about the time. And there was an increased time pressure for a tests that had no time limit, which is a little bit bizarre. Tell the students about the test structure, how many questions per page, the length, all of that kind of thing. Help them with navigation. So again, how many questions per page? Do they have to scroll, or is it going to just show up with one question per page and they have to click? How do they click next page? Some students weren't sure if they clicked next page, was it going to automatically save, or did they have to click a save button? Because sometimes you have to do that in other programs. Teach them how the tracking bar works at the top and how to read it, and how to submit at the end. Some students didn't know whether their test was actually submitted or if they pressed something accidentally and their test just closed. Teach students how to use the different accommodations. So there's highlighters, sticky notes, text-to-speech, scrap paper. Explicitly show them how to structure scrap paper so it's effective, and allow time for onboarding. That means explicit teaching of how to use the platform, as well as regular practice in the test. So I know that the assessment master platform is quite expensive. If your school can afford it, I would recommend do get it, because that's how students learn. All right, we're going to take a look at a past digital assessment. I should already have one open here. Okay, so this is what students see. The fascinating thing is there's lots of stuff to read, but just like students, I'm just going down and clicking next, next, next. Every single student saw this page on Poly at the beginning of their test. Most of the students I talked to did not know what Poly was, or that it existed, or that there was text-to-speech, because they did not read it, because they're just clicking next. There's no, it's kind of that inherent thing, like when we look at agreements on when you get to download a new app and it goes, hey, did you read the whole thing? You're like, oh yeah, totally agree. So even this page, students can use this tracker to go to different parts of the test. This tells me this test has 5 different parts. I can go up to the achievement criteria here, click on it, and it tells me what I need to get achieved merit and excellence. If I click on the first one, for example, it brings me to the first page of the assessment. And it's important to tell students this is a page, which means you need to scroll. It doesn't all show up in one spot. All right. As we're working on this, we can see across the top, there's a tracking bar. It tells me currently I'm on page number 1. As I fill this up, this tracking bar is going to change to solid blue. But here's the important part that not a single student that I talked to knew existed. Right up here, there's this thing that says highlights and notes. If we click on this, students have 2 different colors of highlighters that they could use. So I could click here, I can highlight, and then I hover over my highlighted bit and I can write a note. This is the online scrap paper, and students can write themselves whatever they need to.
Was that available this year? I have
Yes,
a feeling
it was.
that like 2 weeks before the assessment, NZQA said they were going to pull it.
Yeah, it was on this year's work. And then you can delete it. You can, if you have a sticky note, but then you go and erase the entire eraser, it takes away the sticky note as well. So none of the students that I talked to knew that that was even a thing. However, all of the students that I talked to said that if they were aware, they would have used it. But again, as you said, if it is being pulled or things are being updated, it's really important to stay on top of that so that we can communicate to the student what tools are available to them. A lot of the students talked about the literacy difficulty with the Numeracy CAA, so being able to read questions because they were used to having paper versions that they can circle, they can underline, they can highlight. And if the tools are available for them to accommodate those kinds of skills, they need to know about it too. The most important thing at the end is to make sure that students know how to click finish exam and that they should see all of these spaces filled up before they click finish. Other little things, students weren't aware that at the bottom of every single page, there's this little block that says blank screen. You're supposed to click on it if you go to the bathroom so that other students couldn't see your work. 2 of the students were aware that they felt it was easier for people to cheat off of them because their screen is upright, so other people can see your work a lot easier. So having this blank screen as an option would have given them a lot more of, well, it would have reduced their anxiety of others looking at their screen. But again, they weren't aware that it existed, even though it is here. It is in one of the preliminary slides at the beginning of the test saying use blank screen. Yeah, they're just really, really not aware. And One other thing is just navigating back and forth between screens. It does seem very, very simple that at the bottom, you just click next page, but some students weren't sure if they click next page, if it would delete all of their work. So just that assurance of knowing that these things exist are really important. And just to finish off this presentation, one really, really great quote. This is from one of the students that I interviewed who has cerebral palsy, and he felt that he didn't really get to access mathematics the same as other students throughout most of his life. And he said, for me, maths is the grade that I really want to make sure I get high in to basically prove to myself that I can do stuff because it means self-worth. So these students do care about getting good grades, and it's the duty of the teacher to do what we can in order to make that happen. There are things that are outside of our control, like internet infrastructure and the test structure, but there are things that are in our control, like teaching the digital atmosphere. So if we can do that much, that would make a huge impact. All right, that's pretty much it. There's a bunch of citations here, 1, 2, 3 pages of citations. Yeah, there we go.
Thank you so much, Amber. I'm just going to quickly share my slides before everyone disappears. I've got a few little messages. Hopefully it works. Rani, is that showing? Okay, so you're welcome to share your feedback directly in the chat there. If you've got any other suggestions for future sessions or you'd like to present on something, then the AMA Online Organizer email is useful. We've got some events coming up. Obviously, the NZAM conference, which was talked about earlier this morning, is in the July holidays. We've got Maths Week, we've got Mathx, Auckland Mathx in August, and then another AMA Online session. There's also cluster meetings that if you're a teacher that's in Auckland, the Auckland cluster meetings are happening. Reach out to the AMA if you're not too sure about that or how to get involved.